A luxury tower lobby in Seoul. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished to a mirror finish. Two of the city's most powerful organizations assembled on opposite sides of a corridor, watching two men establish, in public and deliberately, who held the higher ground. Choi Sang-Ho, the most feared name in Seoul's criminal infrastructure, raised his hand toward Lee Jae-Sung's lapel. A gesture, a performance of dominance staged for every pair of eyes in that corridor. The room held its breath. Then one voice changed everything. Quiet, composed, 4 words delivered without heat and without hesitation, the way you state a fact that requires no argument. Take your hands off my husband. The woman in the white dress and the white evening gloves did not raise her voice. She did not need to. What she did next put Choi Sang-Ho on the marble floor in front of every witness he had assembled to watch his own victory. The chandeliers kept glittering. The room did not move for 3 full seconds, and Choi Sang-Ho, getting up from the floor with his pride destroyed and his fury ignited, made the last mistake of his life. He looked at Chioma Thompson and saw only a wife. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever been in a room where someone was completely invisible until the moment they became the only thing anyone could see? Because that is what this story is about. Subscribe to the channel if you're here for stories of precision, patience, and the specific kind of justice that arrives not with noise, but with inevitability. The lobby of that Seoul tower smelled of cold marble and expensive ambition, the kind of setting that powerful men choose deliberately, because power, in their world, is always performed for an audience. Choi Sang-Ho had chosen his audience carefully. What he had not chosen, what he had not even registered as a variable, was the woman standing beside Lee Jae-Sung in the white dress. Nobody in that room had. That was their mistake, and it was about to become his reckoning. Seoul had a way of making you into whatever it needed you to be. Chioma Thompson had understood this early, within the first month of arriving in the city, before she had fully committed to staying, before Lee Jae-Sung had become her husband rather than the man she was deciding about. Seoul was a city of precise social categories, and it read people quickly and filed them accordingly, and the category it had for her was legible and comfortable and almost entirely wrong. The beautiful foreign wife. Elegant, composed, decorative in the specific way that powerful men's partners are decorative, present at the right events, impeccably dressed, soft-spoken enough that the room never had to adjust itself to accommodate her. She had not corrected the category, she had furnished it. The Lee household ran with the kind of quiet efficiency that people attributed to good staff and Jae-Sung's organizational discipline, neither of which was wrong, but neither of which was the full answer. The full answer was Chioma, moving through the household in the early mornings before the staff arrived, assessing, adjusting, noting the 17 things that needed attention and addressing 12 of them before anyone else had their first coffee. She managed the household the way she managed everything, thoroughly, without announcing that she was doing it, in a way that made the result look effortless because the effort was invisible. This was a skill she had learned long before Seoul. It had a different name in her previous life. At official functions, she stood beside Jae-Sung with the composed grace of a woman who understood the room's expectations and had decided, as a matter of strategy, to meet them precisely. She smiled at the right moments, she deflected personal questions with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that the most effective deflections feel like answers. She wore the clothes that the role required and wore them well, because if you were going to maintain a performance, you maintained it completely. Half measures were their own kind of exposure. Jae-Sung knew she had a military background. He knew she had served. He did not know the full record, the specific operations, the classified weight of what those years had actually contained, because she had given him the outline and kept the substance to herself. Not from dishonesty, from the specific caution of a woman who understood that some truths change the architecture of a relationship permanently, and who had not yet determined whether their architecture could hold that weight. She loved him. That was the uncomplicated part. The complicated part was everything she was while loving him, the full, specific, trained and operational version of herself that she kept behind the elegant exterior like a second room in a house with one visible door. The gap between what Seoul saw and what she was, that was where the story lived. She had been living in that gap for 3 years. She had not expected the lobby to close it, but then she had not expected Choi Sang-Ho to reach for her husband's suit in a room full of witnesses either. Some things arrived on their own schedule, regardless of what you had planned for Tuesday. Choi Sang-Ho chose the venue the way he chose everything, for maximum effect. The Grand Mirai Tower lobby was Seoul's most visible neutral ground, which meant it was not neutral at all. It was a stage, and Choi Sang-Ho understood stages. He had assembled his people on the east side of the corridor with the deliberate precision of a man arranging an audience for a performance he had already scripted. The message was not the confrontation itself. The message were the witnesses. Every person in that lobby would carry what they saw back to every corner of the city, and what they would carry was the image of Lee Jae-Sung conceding ground in public. That was the plan. Chioma had assessed it within 30 seconds of entering the lobby. She had noted the positioning of Sang-Ho's people, the sightlines, the ratio of his associates to Lee Jae-Sung's, and the specific theatrical quality of his entrance, late enough to be an entrance, not late enough to be a concession. She had noted it all, and stood beside her husband with her hands clasped and her expression composed, and said nothing, because the assessment was complete, and what came next would depend on Sang-Ho, and Sang-Ho was entirely predictable to anyone who understood the grammar of men who performed power for audiences. He opened with condescension dressed as courtesy, the practiced graciousness of a man who wanted the room to see his patience before they saw his force. He spoke at length about the city's changing landscape, about the natural consolidation of influence, about the wisdom of recognizing which direction the tide was moving. He looked at Jae-Sung the way you look at a decision you have already made. Jae-Sung listened with the measured stillness he brought to every room, not passive, not provoked, simply present in the way of a man who understood that a response given in your opponent's rhythm was a response given on your opponent's terms. Then Sang-Ho reached for the lapel. It was a gesture, precisely calculated, the physical punctuation of everything he had just said. A hand on another man's suit in public was a specific kind of statement, and he had timed it for the room's full attention. He did not complete the gesture. Chioma's right hand intercepted his wrist with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided, some seconds earlier, exactly what she was going to do. She held it for one moment, long enough to be unambiguous, and looked at him with the composed, unhurried expression she wore in every room, which was the same expression in which now contained something that had not been visible in it before. "Take your hands off my husband." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. What followed took less time than the room had to process what was happening. Sang-Ho was on the marble floor. She almost stood where she had been standing, her posture unchanged, her expression unchanged, her white evening gloves immaculate. The chandeliers glittered above the silence. 30 people did not move. Jae-Sung looked at his wife with an expression she had not seen on him before and would spend some time afterward trying to accurately name. Sang-Ho stood up slowly. His suit was damaged, his pride was destroyed, his fury, carefully contained behind the rigid mask of a man who would not give a room the satisfaction of his reaction, was the most dangerous thing in the lobby. He straightened. He looked at Chioma with the specific assessing quality of a man filing something away for later. Then he turned and walked out with his people behind him. The room exhaled, quietly and all at once. Chioma unclenched her right hand and clasped it with the left, the way she always held her hands, and waited for the lobby to remember how to be a lobby again. Sang-Ho did not retaliate immediately, which was the most dangerous sign. Chioma had expected noise, the instinctive visible fury of a humiliated man converting shame to aggression in the way that humiliated men typically did. What she got instead was silence, and silence from Choi Sang-Ho meant he had bypassed fury entirely and gone straight to architecture. He was building something. She began paying the kind of attention she had not paid to anything in 3 years. The first move came 11 days later through a financial institution in Mapo that held a significant portion of the Lee organization's legitimate business interests. A regulatory inquiry, routine in its language, precise in its timing, originating from a department whose director had, Chioma confirmed through 3 days of quiet research, attended the same university as 2 of Sang-Ho's known political connections. The inquiry itself was not threatening. The inquiry was a signal. It said, "I have reach into your infrastructure. I am showing you 1 inch of it." Jae-Sung's financial team prepared a conventional response. Chioma read it, said nothing, and spent the following evening drafting a different one. She did not explain the draft. She set it on Jae-Sung's desk with a note that said the regulatory language contained 2 procedural irregularities that, if documented and submitted through the correct channel before the response deadline, would redirect the inquiry to a review board whose composition was less accommodating to political interference. Jae-Sung read it twice. He submitted her version. The inquiry dissolved within a week. Sang-Ho's second move came through a supply chain, a logistics partner whose contract with the Lee organization was quietly pressured to renegotiate on terms that would have been operationally damaging over the following 6 months. Chioma had identified the pressure point before the renegotiation request arrived because she had been mapping Sang-Ho's network for 3 weeks, and she understood from the pattern of his first move that he was working from the outside of the Lee organization structure inward, testing boundaries methodically before committing to a primary line of attack. She had already drafted the counter by the time the request landed. This continued for 5 weeks. Sang-Ho would move, the Lee organization would respond, not in the way he had predicted, not in the conventional register he had prepared counters for, but in a way that was always precisely calibrated to neutralize his approach and occasionally to redirect its consequences back towards him. His advisors, she understood from the pattern of his escalations, were becoming confused. His machine was working and producing the incorrect results, which meant the variable he had not accounted for was operating somewhere inside his blind spot. He did not know about Chioma because nobody knew about Chioma. She was the quiet wife. She sat at the right dinners and wore the right clothes, and her name appeared on no organizational document. She was also 3 moves ahead of him at every turn, systematically dismantling his campaign before it could find its footing. He would figure out the variable eventually. She was aware of that. She was using the time before he did to build something he would not be able to dismantle when he finally understood what he was dealing with. She worked in the early mornings, before the household woke, in the same hours she had always used for the things that mattered most. The thing about fighting someone 3 moves ahead of you is that you do not know you are losing until the shape of it is already complete. Sang-Ho's advisors knew something was wrong by the 3rd week. His primary financial strategist, a man who had dismantled 4 organizations in the previous decade and had never once encountered a counter he could not trace to its source, began presenting his assessments with a qualifier he had not previously used: unexpectedly. The Lee organization had unexpectedly redirected the Mapo pressure. The supply chain renegotiation had unexpectedly collapsed. The back-channel regulatory contact had unexpectedly become a liability rather than a tool when the procedural irregularity was documented and submitted before anyone on Sang-Ho's side had identified that the irregularity existed. Sang-Ho listened to the qualifier accumulate across 3 consecutive briefings and understood that his strategist was telling him, in the careful language of a man who valued his employment, that the Lee organization was not responding the way it was supposed to respond. He increased the pressure. This was his established method. When a target proved more resilient than anticipated, the correct response was escalation, because in his experience, resilience was always finite, and the organization that held longest won. He moved simultaneously against two of the Lee organization's business partnerships, applying political pressure through connections that had never previously failed to produce results, while redirecting a financial instrument through a third channel designed to create a liquidity problem that would force a reactive decision under time pressure. All three moves were sound. He had used each of them before in different combinations against more established targets. By the following Tuesday, the political pressure on the first partnership had been neutralized through a counterfiling he had not anticipated. The second partnership had restructured its agreement in a way that removed the pressure point entirely. The financial instrument had been identified, documented, and reported to a regulatory body through a channel that he could not interfere with without creating a significantly larger problem for himself. He sat with his strategist's briefing and experienced something he had not felt in a professional context since his early years, the specific, disorienting uncertainty of a man who has executed his plan correctly and received the wrong outcome 3 times in a row without being able to identify why. He was not accustomed to uncertainty. It produced in him not caution, but a dangerous restlessness, the instinct of a man who had always resolved confusion through force, who had learned early that enough pressure applied to any structure would eventually reveal its weak point. He began looking for the weak point. He looked where he always looked, at the person rather than the organization, Lee Jae-Sung's household, his staff, his associations, the variables closest to him that conventional security analysis would not have fully hardened. He looked at the household and he saw the wife. Elegant, composed, soft-featured, American, which in his assessment meant unfamiliar with the specific terrain of Seoul's organizational conflicts. He filed her under negligible and moved toward the next phase. It was the most consequential misreading of his career. He would not understand that until considerably later, by which point the understanding would not be useful to him. The operative arrived on a Thursday evening through the service entrance, which meant Sang-Ho had someone inside the household's logistics network, a detail Chioma noted and filed for later, because later was when it would be useful and now was not later. She had been aware of him for 4 minutes before he reached the interior of the residence, not from a security alert, from the specific quality of a sound that was almost correct and not quite, the kind of almost that only registered if you had spent years learning the difference between a building settling and a building being moved through by someone who did not want to be heard. She had spent years learning that difference in environments where the cost of missing it was final. She set down the document she had been reviewing. She moved to the position she had identified in her first week in the residence as the optimal point for this exact scenario, not because she had expected this exact scenario, but because identifying optimal positions was something she did automatically, the way other people checked that they had their keys. The encounter was brief. The operative was professional, well-trained, specifically briefed, carrying accurate intelligence about her schedule and her location in the residence, and what Sang-Ho believed to be her complete absence of tactical capability. That last piece of intelligence was the operative's primary disadvantage, and it was, in the context of the encounter, decisive. Afterward, she secured the residence, contacted the appropriate people about the service entrance, and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes in the specific stillness that followed operational activity. Not shock, not adrenaline, but the particular quiet of a body that has done what it was trained to do and is now returning to its baseline. Then she called Jae-Sung. He came home within the hour. She told him everything. Not the outline she had given him when they met, not the managed version she had maintained across 3 years of marriage, but the full record. The service, the operations, the classified weight of what those years had actually contained and what she was actually capable of, and what had just happened in their residence because Sang-Ho made the specific mistake of sending a professional to deal with someone he had assessed as not a professional. She told him with the composure she brought to everything, because the composure was real and not a performance, and she watched him receive it. He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the silence because she had learned that some silences required space rather than management. When he spoke, he did not ask why she had kept it from him. He only asked one question, in a voice that was careful and direct, and contained something she recognized as the sound of a man making a decision about what kind of person he was going to be in this moment. "What do you need from me?" It was the right question. It was the only question that mattered. She felt something shift in the architecture of the room. Not dramatically, not with the quality of a resolution, but with the quiet irreversibility of something that has been decided. "Your organizational resources," she said, "and the understanding that from this point forward, I'm not the quiet wife." He looked at her for a long moment with the full, unhurried attention of a man seeing something he had not previously been permitted to see completely. "You were never the quiet wife," he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said, "I wasn't." He did not sleep that night. She knew because she did not sleep either, and the residence had the particular quality of two people lying awake on the same side of the same question without yet having found the language to ask it directly. In the morning, he was at the kitchen table when she came downstairs, which was unusual. He was not a kitchen table person, he was a study person, and his presence in her space at 6 in the morning meant he had been thinking about something that required a different room than the one where he thought professionally. She made coffee without comment and set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him and waited, because she had learned that Jae-Sung processed things completely before he presented them, and that interrupting the process produced a less honest result. He asked her about the operations, not with the tone of an interrogation, with the specific, careful attention of a man who understood that he had been given incomplete information for 3 years and who wanted, now, the full picture. She gave it to him. Not everything was hers to give. Some of the record was classified in ways that were not hers to declassify, even in a kitchen at 6 in the morning, for the man she had married. But she gave him the shape of it, the weight of it, the honest answer to the question of who she had been before Seoul and what that person had done and what it had cost her. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, processing each piece before moving to the next. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "When we met, you knew what I was." "Yes." "And you stayed." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me what you were?" It was the right question, and the honest answer was complicated, so she gave him the honest answer. She had not told him because she had not been certain the marriage could hold the full weight of her. She had built the quiet wife because the quiet wife was true. She was genuinely composed, genuinely elegant, genuinely present in the life they had built, but she was also incomplete. And she had maintained the incompleteness because she was afraid that the complete version of herself was too much for any ordinary architecture to contain. He looked at her for a long time after that. "I married you," he said finally, "because you were the only person I had ever met who saw my world completely and was not afraid of it and did not want anything from it except me." He paused. "Did you think I would be less than that for you?" She had not expected the question to land where it landed. She sat with it. "I didn't know," she said. "I wasn't certain." "And now?" She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light, this man she had chosen and not fully trusted with herself, who was looking back at her with the open, unhurried attention of someone who had just been given something real and was holding it carefully. "Now, I'm certain," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was simply true, said in the register that true things deserved, and it settled between them with the quiet permanence of something that had been decided and would not need to be decided again. She began with the connections rather than the crimes, because the connections were the structure and the crimes were merely what the structure had been built to protect. Remove the structure first, and the crimes had nowhere to shelter. This was the principle she had learned in her second operational year and had never found a reason to revise. Sang-Ho's political protection was layered in the way that all durable protection was layered. Not a single relationship, but a network of mutual dependence, each connection reinforcing the others, designed so that attacking any single point would alert the whole. The network had kept him untouchable for 11 years. It was, she acknowledged, with the professional respect she extended to competent architecture regardless of its purpose, well constructed. She did not attack it. She mapped it. This took 3 weeks. She worked from the outside of the network inward, identifying each connection through the paper trail that every relationship, however carefully managed, eventually produced. Financial records, meeting logs, the specific timing of regulatory decisions that had resolved in Sang-Ho's favor across 11 years, cross-referenced against the professional calendars of the officials who had made them. She built the map in the early mornings with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that incomplete intelligence was more dangerous than no intelligence, and she did not move to the next phase until the map was complete. When it was complete, she identified the connection that was simultaneously the most significant and the most exposed, a senior official whose relationship with Sang-Ho had produced the most documentable benefit and whose own record contained the most documentable irregularity. Not the most powerful connection, the most vulnerable one. She had learned that networks unraveled from their weakest point, and that the weakest point was almost never where the network believed its weakness to be. She delivered the documentation to 2 journalists and 1 prosecutor through channels that had been specifically selected for their independence from the political infrastructure she was dismantling. She did not deliver it simultaneously. She delivered it in sequence, timed so that each disclosure created the conditions that made the next one easier to publish and harder to suppress. The first disclosure produced a denial. The second produced a counter-disclosure from a source within the official's own office who had been waiting, apparently, for evidence that the exposure was survivable. The third produced a prosecutor's inquiry that the political network could not suppress without drawing more attention to itself than the inquiry itself warranted. She watched this from the residence with the patient attention of someone monitoring a process they have set in motion and trust to proceed according to its own logic. She did not accelerate it. She did not need to. She had built it to run on its own momentum, removing Sang-Ho's ability to interfere at each stage before the stage became visible. He was watching the network unravel and could not find the origin point of the unraveling. She had ensured that. The operation had no visible center, no attributable source, no surface for him to attack because there was no surface to find. She had been trained to finish things. She was finishing this one with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, completely, without announcing it, in a way that would make the result look inevitable. Because it was. It had been inevitable from the moment he reached for her husband's suit in a lobby full of witnesses, and she had decided, with the composed certainty that characterized every decision she had ever made that mattered, exactly what she was going to do about it. The first official resigned on a Tuesday morning with a statement that was brief and carefully worded and conspicuously silent on the specific nature of the irregularities that have made resignation preferable to continued service. By Thursday, 2 more had followed, their statements similarly brief and similarly silent, and the silence itself had become a kind of disclosure, the specific eloquence of people who could not explain their departures without explaining what they were departing from. Sang-Ho watched this from the position he had always occupied, above the immediate damage, protected by the layers of institutional relationship that had insulated him from consequence for 11 years. He watched the first resignation and assessed it as manageable. He watched the second and third and began making calls. The calls were not returned with the speed he was accustomed to. This was the mechanism Chioma had understood from the beginning, that the protection was not absolute, it was transactional, and the transaction depended on the protected party remaining more valuable to protect than to distance from. The moment that calculation shifted, the protection did not disappear gradually, it disappeared at once, because the people providing it were experienced enough to understand that proximity to a collapsing situation was its own kind of exposure, and they moved accordingly. Within 2 weeks, the network had not been destroyed. It had simply stopped functioning in his direction. The connections remained. The relationships remained. What had changed was the determination of the people in those relationships that Choi Sang-Ho was no longer a party they could afford to be connected to. Without the network, his crimes were simply his crimes. The prosecutor's inquiry, no longer suppressible, expanded with the specific momentum of an investigation that has been waiting for permission to move. Documentation that had been held at various institutional points for years began arriving through the formal channels it had always been owed. Associates who had calculated the cost of loyalty against the cost of exposure and had previously found loyalty more affordable began recalculating. The recalculation did not take long. Sang-Ho's organization did not collapse dramatically. It contracted quickly and then all at once, in the way that structures collapse when the load-bearing elements are removed, not by force, but by withdrawal. People who had operated under his protection for years discovered that the protection had a very specific source and that the source had been compromised, and they responded with the rational self-preservation of people who had survived as long as they had by correctly identifying which way a situation was moving. He was arrested on a Wednesday morning, not in a staged location, not with an audience, in his own building, by a prosecutor's office that had spent 3 weeks assembling a record so complete that the arrest required no drama. The record spoke for itself. It had always spoken for itself. It had simply for 11 years been speaking into rooms that were not configured to hear it. The rooms were configured now. Chioma had reconfigured them, one connection at a time, with the thoroughness she brought to everything she decided to finish. She read the arrest confirmation at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, with her coffee precise and her expression composed, and the quiet, complete satisfaction of a completed operation settling in her chest like something that had been held for a long time, finally being set down. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and she attended every session. Not from obligation, there was no tactical reason for her presence in the courtroom. The operation was complete, and its outcome was no longer something she could influence or needed to. She attended because she had started this, and she intended to be present when it finished, which was a principle she had held for as long as she had held any principle, and which applied here as it had applied everywhere. She wore white each time, not as a statement. She was not interested in statements. It was simply the color she had been wearing when it began, and there was a completeness to the symmetry that she appreciated without needing to explain. The courtroom was ordinary in the way that rooms where consequential things happen are often ordinary, functional, fluorescent, entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being decided inside it. Sang-Ho sat at the defense table with the diminished quality of a man who had spent 11 years drawing his stature from a network that no longer existed, discovering without the network the stature had no independent structure. He was still composed. He was also unmistakably smaller than the room he had occupied 6 months ago. The crimes, documented and presented without the interference of the protection that had suppressed them for over a decade, were grievous in the specific and unambiguous way of things that had been hidden precisely because they could not survive exposure. The record required no embellishment. It required only an audience that was configured to hear it, and the courtroom was that audience. The sentence was delivered on a Thursday morning. The judge read it with the measured cadence of someone who had considered it completely and had no uncertainty about its correctness. Chioma listened to the words with the composed expression she had always worn in public. But it was not the performance anymore, the careful, maintained composure of a woman managing the gap between what she was and what the room could see. It was simply her face. The performance had ended somewhere in a kitchen at 6 in the morning when she had told the truth to the man she married, and he had held it carefully, and she had not put the performance back on because she had discovered that she did not need it anymore. She found Jae-Sung's eyes across the courtroom when the sentence was confirmed. He was looking at her with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had been given something rare, the complete version of a person he had loved incompletely for 3 years, and who was still, months later, in the process of fully receiving it. She let him look. She had spent 3 years managing what he could see of her, calibrating the visibility, maintaining the frame. She did not do that anymore. The courtroom began its ordinary dispersal around them, voices, movements, the mundane sounds of an official proceeding concluding. They did not move immediately. Later, in the ordinary light of their kitchen and the honest room their marriage had become, he took her hand across the table with the simple directness of a man who had stopped being careful about showing what mattered to him. She let him do that too. It was not a grand thing. It was simply true and present and entirely theirs. The life on the other side of the performance, which turned out to be larger and more honest than anything the performance had been built to protect. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. The most dangerous assumption you can make about a person is that the surface is the whole story. Sang-Ho looked at Chioma and saw decoration. He saw a wife. He saw the frame and mistook it for the painting. And that single arrogant miscalculation cost him everything. Not because she was hiding, but because he never once thought to look. Here is the lesson. Underestimating someone doesn't make them smaller. It makes you blind, and blindness in a contest against someone who sees everything is not a disadvantage. It is a defeat that hasn't finished arriving yet. But this story has a second lesson that is quieter and more personal. The people who love us deserve the full version of us, not the managed version, not the version we decided they could handle, but the real one. Chioma protected Jae-Sung from the truth of who she was because she wasn't certain their marriage was large enough to hold her completely. What she discovered is what many of us discovered too late, that the people worth keeping are exactly the ones who, when given the full weight of you, simply ask, "What do you need from me?" For everyone watching who has made themselves smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort, you were never too much. You were just with the wrong people or hadn't yet trusted the right ones. Stop performing. Start being seen. Thanks for watching. Check out the video at the upper right of the screen. You will find it entertaining.